Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the human vessel Liberty's Edge and looked at the massive holographic display that showed hundreds of alien ships floating in space. The Galactic Council had called every species to this meeting, and Jake could see ships from dozens of different worlds. Some were huge and covered in glowing armor. Others were small and fast with strange energy wings, and a few looked like they were made of living metal that moved and shifted on its own. Jake had been captain of the Liberty's Edge for 2 years now, ever since humanity joined the Galactic Council. In those 2 years, he had learned one thing very clearly. The other species thought humans were weak. They were polite about it, of course. The tall, blue-skinned Zelani would nod respectfully when they spoke to him. The massive, rock-like Korath would grunt in acknowledgement. The bird-like Thirani would chirp something that their translator said was a greeting. But Jake could see it in their eyes, or whatever they had instead of eyes. They looked at humans the way humans might look at a child trying to help with grown-up work. Commander Lisa Hayes walked up to Jake and handed him a datapad. Lisa was his second in command, and she had been studying the alien military reports for weeks. Her face showed the same frustration that Jake felt every day. "The assignments are in, Captain," Lisa said. "We're on medical duty again." Jake took the datapad and read through the mission briefings. The Zelani would be operating their famous energy shields that could stop almost any attack. The Korath were bringing their plasma cannons that could melt through the strongest armor. The Thirani had their telepathic battle coordination that let them fight as one mind across entire fleets. The smaller species each had their own special abilities. Some could become invisible, others could move through solid matter, and a few could predict enemy movements before they happened. And the humans? The humans were assigned to drive supply, ships, and run medical stations. "Same as always," Jake said, and handed the datapad back to Lisa. "We bring the bandages, while everyone else brings the weapons." The reason for this meeting was serious. The Vorthek Empire had declared war on the Galactic Council. Jake had seen the intelligence reports about the Vorthek, and they were terrifying. They stood 8 feet tall in their powered armor. They had never lost a battle, and they conquered entire star systems for fun. Their weapons could punch through any known armor, and their ships were bigger and stronger than anything the Council had. Every species was scared of the Vorthek, but they were all contributing their best warriors and most advanced technology. Everyone except the humans. Admiral Kevin Torres was in the war room with the other Council military leaders. Jake watched through the view screen as Torres tried to argue for giving humans a real combat role. The other leaders listened politely, but Jake could see they weren't taking Torres seriously. The Zelani admiral gestured with his long, thin arms as he explained why human weapons were too primitive for modern warfare. The Korath general slammed his massive fist on the table and growled something about human reflexes being too slow. The Thirani commander's feathers ruffled as she spoke in her singing voice about how human tactical thinking was too simple for multi-dimensional space combat. Torres kept trying to make his case, but Jake knew it was hopeless. The other species had run computer simulations, and the results were always the same. Human weapons were outdated projectile technology from hundreds of years ago. Human ships were slow and clumsy compared to the sleek alien vessels. Human soldiers were weak and fragile compared to the other species' natural armor and enhanced. ABILITIES Dr. Amy Foster was down in the medical bay, preparing her teams for what everyone expected to be a massacre. Amy was the best doctor in the human fleet, and she had been working with alien biology for 3 years. She understood the other species' bodies better than most of their own doctors did. But even Amy couldn't hide her worry about the coming battle. "The Vorthek have never been defeated," Amy told her medical staff. "Their armor is almost impossible to penetrate. Their weapons can kill from miles away, and they don't take prisoners. We need to be ready for heavy casualties. Jake walked down to the medical bay to check on the preparations. Amy looked up from her supply lists and shook her head. I've been studying the Vorthic for weeks, Amy said. They're built for war. Their bones are 3 times denser than human bones. Their muscles are enhanced with cybernetic implants, and their armor is integrated with their nervous systems. They're not just soldiers, they're living weapons. The medical teams were loading supplies and checking equipment. Jake watched the human medics work and felt a familiar frustration. These people were skilled and dedicated, but they were being treated like support staff, while the real warriors prepared for battle. In the hangar bay, the human pilots were checking their fighters. The Liberty's Edge carried 20 small combat ships, but they were armed with old-fashioned missiles and projectile weapons. Next to them, the alien fighters looked like works of art. The Zalani ships glowed with energy fields. The Korath fighters were covered in weapon systems, and the Thirani vessels seemed to dance through the air, even while standing still. Lieutenant Colonel Ryan Davis was the leader of the human Marines, and he was trying to keep his soldiers' morale up. Ryan was a good officer, but Jake could see the doubt in his eyes. The human Marines were well trained and disciplined, but they were going up against an enemy that had conquered half the galaxy. Remember your training, Ryan told his troops. We stick together, we follow orders, and we watch each other's backs. The other species might have better technology, but we have something they don't understand. What's that, sir? Asked one of the younger Marines. Ryan was quiet for a moment. Then he smiled. We're too stupid to know when we're beaten. The Marines laughed, but Jake could hear the nervousness in their voices. They were good soldiers, but they knew they were considered the weakest link in the Council's chain as the combined fleet prepared to leave for the battle zone. Jake received a message from the Council's military command. The human ships were to stay in the rear guard, away from the main fighting. Their job was to rescue survivors and provide medical support after the real warriors had won or lost the battle. Jake looked out at the alien ships around him. They were beautiful and deadly, each one a masterpiece of their species' technology and military thinking. Compared to them, the human ships looked like crude metal boxes with engines attached. But as Jake watched his crew prepare for battle, he felt something that the other species' computer simulations had never measured. His people were scared, yes, but they weren't backing down. They were checking their weapons, reviewing their duties, and preparing to do their jobs no matter what happened. The Liberty's Edge and the other human ships took their positions at the back of the formation. As the fleet entered hyperspace and headed toward the battle zone, Jake wondered if this would be the day that humanity proved it belonged among the stars, or the day that proved they were too weak to survive in a galaxy full of warriors. He would find out soon enough. The battle began at dawn on the 3rd planet of the Kepler 442 system. Jake Morrison watched from the Liberty's Edge as the Vorthic fleet came out of hyperspace like a dark cloud of death. Their ships were massive, black, and covered in weapons that glowed with red energy. The largest ship was 3 times bigger than anything the Council had, and it was surrounded by hundreds of smaller vessels that moved in perfect formation. The Vorthic opened fire immediately. Their weapons shot beams of red energy that cut through the Zalani ships like they were made of paper. The famous Zalani energy shields, which had protected their people for thousands of years, lasted exactly 12 seconds against the Vorthic. Attack! Jake watched in horror as the beautiful blue ships exploded in brilliant flashes of light. My God, whispered Lisa Hayes, who was standing next to Jake on the bridge. They're not even slowing down. The Korath fleet tried to fight back with their plasma cannons, but the Vorthic armor absorbed the energy blasts without even flickering. The massive rock-like warriors, who had seemed so powerful just hours before, were being destroyed by an enemy that was even more powerful. Lieutenant Colonel Ryan Davis was monitoring the battle communications from the Marine deck. The radio was full of panic and confusion as the Council's finest warriors realized they were facing something beyond their understanding. The Therani's telepathic coordination was being jammed by some kind of psychic dampening field that the Vorthic had deployed. The smaller species with their special abilities were being picked off one by enemy weapons that seemed to target their specific weaknesses. "Captain," Ryan called up to the bridge, "the Council fleet is retreating. Half of them are already gone." Jake looked at the tactical display and saw that Ryan was right. The organized battle formation had collapsed into chaos as surviving ships fled in all directions. The Vorthic weren't just winning, they were demonstrating their complete superiority. Over everything the Council could throw at them, Dr. Amy Foster was in the medical bay, treating wounded aliens who had been brought aboard by rescue shuttles. She had never seen injuries like these before. The Vorthic weapons didn't just kill, they destroyed. Bodies were burned and torn apart by energy that seemed to eat through living tissue. Amy worked frantically to save lives, but for every alien she helped, 10 more died from wounds that no medical technology could heal. "We need to get out of here," Amy told Jake over the communication system. "The medical bay is full, and more wounded are coming in every minute. We can't save them all." Jake knew Amy was right, but he also knew something else. The human ships were the only ones still holding their position. While the alien vessels fled or were destroyed, the Liberty's Edge and the other human ships had stayed where they were ordered to be. They were following their orders, even though those orders were getting them killed. "Captain," Lisa said, "Admiral Torres is ordering all human ships to retreat to the rear staging area." Jake looked at the tactical display again. The Vorthic were advancing toward the planet's surface, and their ground forces were preparing to land. The few Council ships that were still fighting were being systematically destroyed. In another hour, the battle would be over, and the Vorthic would have won their easiest victory ever. "No," Jake said quietly. "Sir?" Lisa looked confused. "I said no, we're not retreating." Jake turned to the communications officer. "Send a message to all human ships. We're moving to the front lines." The bridge went quiet. Everyone knew that moving toward the Vorthic fleet was suicide. The human ships were outgunned, outnumbered, and outmatched in every possible way. But Jake had made his decision. "Captain," Lisa said, "Admiral Torres is ordering us to fall back. Tell the Admiral that we didn't come here to watch our allies die," Jake replied. "All ships move forward. We're going to give the Vorthic something to think about." The Liberty's Edge and the other human ships changed course and headed straight toward the Vorthic fleet. The alien commanders who were still alive watched in amazement as the humans, who everyone had considered the weakest members of the Council, flew directly into the most dangerous part of the battle. The first direct fight between human and Vorthic forces happened on the surface of the planet. The Vorthic warriors were everything the intelligence reports had said they would be. They stood 8 feet tall in their powered armor. They moved with deadly precision, and their weapons could kill a human soldier from half a mile away. Squad leader Danny Miller was leading a group of human Marines when they encountered their first Vorthic patrol. The enemy warriors looked like metal giants as they walked through the burning ruins of a Council outpost. Their armor was black and covered in spikes, and their weapons glowed with the same red energy that had destroyed the fleet. "Open fire!" Danny shouted. The human weapons seemed pathetic compared to the Vorthic technology. The Marines were using old-fashioned rifles that shot metal bullets, while the enemy had energy weapons that could melt through solid rock. But the humans kept fighting even after half their squad was killed in the first exchange of fire. Danny was hit by a Vorthic energy blast that burned through his armor and into his chest. He could feel his ribs breaking and his lung filling with blood, but he kept shooting. Sergeant Claire Thompson, who was fighting next to him, had her rifle destroyed by enemy fire. She grabbed a grenade from her belt and threw it at the nearest Vorthic warrior. The grenade exploded against the alien's armor and did almost no damage, but it got the warrior's attention. While he was turning to face Claire, Danny was able to get close enough to shoot him in the neck joint where his armor was thinner. The Vorthic warrior fell, and for a moment, both sides stopped fighting. It was the first time in the battle that a Vorthic had been killed by Council forces. "They can be hurt," Danny said into his radio. Before he collapsed from his wounds, the news spread quickly through the human communications network. The Vorthic were tough, and their armor was strong, but they weren't invincible. The human soldiers began to fight with new determination. They might be outgunned and outnumbered, but they had something the Vorthic didn't expect. They refused to give up. More human squads engaged the enemy across the battlefield. The Vorthic tactical doctrine was based on overwhelming firepower and intimidation. They expected their enemies to break and run when faced with their superior technology. But the humans kept fighting even when they were wounded, even when they're rare. Friends were dying, even when victory seemed impossible. Private Gary Adams was trapped in a burning building with 3 other Marines when a Vorthic squad surrounded them. The enemy warriors were preparing to finish them off when Gary did something that surprised everyone. He started laughing. "What's so funny?" asked the Vorthic commander through his armor's translator. "You guys are supposed to be the scariest thing in the galaxy," Gary said, still laughing. "But you know what? You're just big bullies with fancy toys. And we've been dealing with bullies our whole lives." The Vorthic commander raised his weapon to kill Gary, but the human Marine was already moving. He had rigged an explosive charge to the building's support beam, and when it went off, the entire structure collapsed on top of the enemy squad. Gary and his friends were crushed too, but they had taken 4 Vorthic warriors with them. Similar stories were happening all across the battlefield. The humans were losing, but they were making the enemy pay for every inch of ground. The Vorthic, who had expected an easy victory, found themselves in a grinding fight against an enemy that wouldn't quit. By the end of the first day, the human forces were nearly destroyed. 3/4 of their soldiers were dead or wounded, and their equipment was running low. But they had accomplished something that no other species had managed to do. They had made the Vorthic bleed. That night, as the survivors counted their losses and prepared for the next day's battle, word came from the Vorthic command ship. For the first time in their military history, the Vorthic were requesting reinforcements. The galaxy was about to learn that there was something more dangerous than superior technology and overwhelming firepower. There was the human spirit, and it could not be broken by any weapon. Major Steve Rogers crouched behind a pile of twisted metal that had once been a Zelani transport ship. His squad of Marines was preparing to attack a Vorthic stronghold that had been built in the ruins of a Council military base. Steve had been fighting the Vorthic for 3 days now, and he was starting to understand something important about their enemy. The Vorthic were incredibly strong, and their technology was far beyond anything humans had, but they fought the same way every time. They would march forward in formation, shoot everything in their path, and expect their enemies to either die or run away. It was a simple strategy that had worked for them for hundreds of years. But humans were different. Steve watched the Vorthic patrol through his scope and counted their movements. The lead warrior always stopped at the same spot to scan for enemies. The second warrior always moved to the left to cover the blind spot. The third warrior always stayed in the rear to watch for attacks from behind. They did this every single time, exactly the same way. "Rodriguez," Steve whispered to his sniper, "can you see the joint where the leader's helmet connects to his chest armor?" Sergeant Elena Rodriguez adjusted her rifle scope and nodded. "It's a small target, but I can hit it. When I give the signal, take the shot." Everyone else, aim for the joints and gaps in their armor. Don't waste ammunition on the heavy plates. The attack lasted less than 30 seconds. Rodriguez's shot hit the lead Vorthic warrior in the neck joint, and his helmet flew off. The other Marines concentrated their fire on the knee and elbow joints of the remaining warriors. 2 of the Vorthic fell, and the third retreated after taking damage to his weapon arm. It was a small victory, but it proved something important. The Vorthic armor wasn't invincible if you knew where to aim. Back on the Liberty's edge, engineer Carolyn Wells was working in the ship's workshop with a team of technicians. The table in front of her was covered with pieces of destroyed Vorthok, equipment that had been brought back from the battlefield. Carolyn was trying to figure out how the enemy weapons worked so she could find a way to fight them. The power source is some kind of contained plasma reaction, Carolyn explained to her team. It's incredibly efficient, but it's also unstable. If we can disrupt the containment field, the whole weapon should shut down. Caroline had been working for 18 hours straight, but she was getting close to a breakthrough. She had stripped the energy components from a damaged Vorthic rifle and was trying to attach them to a human projectile weapon. The result looked like something a child had built from spare parts, but the theory was sound. If we can boost the velocity of our bullets with their power source, we might be able to punch through their armor, Caroline said. The first test was conducted in the ship's cargo bay. Caroline's modified rifle was aimed at a piece of Vorthic armor that had been recovered from the battlefield. When she pulled the trigger, the bullet punched through the armor like it was made of thin plastic. It works, Caroline said with a tired smile. We can hurt them. Dr. Amy Foster was making her own discoveries in the medical bay. She had been studying the bodies of dead Vorthic warriors, and she was learning about their biology. The Vorthic were impressive specimens, but they had weaknesses that no one had discovered before. Their respiratory system is completely different from ours, Amy explained to her medical team. They process oxygen through specialized filters in their armor, but the filters are designed to work with their home planet's atmosphere. They can't handle certain chemical compounds that are common in human medications. Amy had been experimenting with aerosol versions of common human painkillers. When she tested them on captured Vorthic equipment, the results were dramatic. The armor's life support systems couldn't filter out the compounds, and they caused the warriors inside to become dizzy and confused. We're not trying to kill them, Amy said. We're trying to make them ineffective. A confused enemy is easier to defeat than a dead one. Captain Jake Morrison was coordinating these discoveries from the bridge of the Liberty's edge. He had realized that humanity's greatest advantage wasn't their technology or their physical strength. It was their ability to learn and adapt quickly to new situations. The Vorthic have been fighting the same way for centuries, Jake told his officers. They rely on their superior equipment and expect their enemies to be intimidated. But humans don't intimidate easily. Jake was developing a new strategy that he called adaptive warfare. Instead of trying to match the Vorthic's technological advantages, human forces would use unconventional tactics that took advantage of their enemy's predictable behavior. Lieutenant Peter Collins was monitoring Vorthic communications from the ship's intelligence center. He had been learning their language and studying their command structure. What he discovered was surprising. Their entire military system is based on a rigid hierarchy, Peter explained to Jake. Every decision has to be approved by higher-ranking officers. If we can eliminate the field commanders, their troops won't know what to do. Peter had intercepted communications from a Vorthic command post that was coordinating attacks across the entire battlefield. The post was heavily defended, but it was also essential to the enemy's operations. If we can take out that command post, we can paralyze their entire force. Peter said. Jake made the decision to attack the command post with a combined human force. It would be dangerous, but it was the kind of unconventional strategy that might actually work. The attack on the Vorthik command post was led by Lieutenant Commander Frank Mitchell, who had volunteered for the mission, even though everyone knew it was probably suicide. Frank's team included 12 Marines, 2 engineers, and a medic. They were armed with Caroline's modified weapons and Amy's chemical compounds. The command post was located in a valley that was surrounded by Vorthik defensive positions. The conventional approach would have been to attack from the front with overwhelming force, but Frank had a different idea. "We're going to approach from below," Frank told his team. The drainage tunnels under the valley connect to the command post's waste disposal system. They won't be expecting an attack from that direction. The tunnel system was dark, narrow, and filled with toxic waste from the Vorthik base. Frank's team crawled through the tunnels for 2 hours before they reached the command post's lower levels. They could hear the enemy officers giving orders in their harsh, guttural language. The attack was swift and brutal. Frank's team used their modified weapons to punch through the Vorthik armor, and they used Amy's chemical compounds to confuse the defenders. Within minutes, the command post was under human control. The effect on the battlefield was immediate. Vorthik forces across the entire area stopped their coordinated attacks and began moving in random directions. Without their commanders to give them orders, the disciplined enemy army became a confused mob. Human forces took advantage of the chaos to launch counterattacks against isolated Vorthik positions. For the first time since the battle began, the humans were winning. News of the victory spread quickly through the Council fleet. The alien commanders who had dismissed humans as weak and ineffective were amazed by what they had accomplished. The Zalani began sending requests for human tactical advisors. The Korath wanted to learn how to modify their weapons using human techniques. The Thirani were fascinated by the human ability to adapt and overcome seemingly impossible odds. But the war was far from over. The Vorthik High Command was preparing to send their elite forces to deal with the human threat. The Death Guard, the most feared warriors in the galaxy, were coming to restore Vorthik dominance. Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the Liberty's Edge and watched the tactical display as more human victories were reported. His people had proved that they belonged in this war, but he knew the real test was still ahead. The Vorthik might have underestimated humans once, but they wouldn't make that mistake again. The next battle would be against an enemy that knew how dangerous humans could be, and that enemy would be coming with everything they had. Jake smiled grimly as he prepared his forces for the next phase of the war. The galaxy was about to learn that there was something more dangerous than superior technology and overwhelming firepower. There was the human spirit, and it grew stronger with every challenge it faced. The news of humanity's victory over the Vorthik regular forces spread throughout the galaxy like wildfire. On Council worlds, alien civilians watched the battle reports with amazement and disbelief. The species that had been considered the weakest member of the Council had defeated the most feared army in the galaxy. But the Vorthik High Command saw things differently. They believed the defeat was due to overconfidence and poor tactical decisions by their field commanders. The humans had simply been lucky, and luck could be overcome with superior planning and overwhelming force. The Vorthik Supreme Council made a decision that would change the course of the war. They would send the Death Guard, their elite warriors, who had never known defeat, to crush the human rebellion once and for all. Colonel Nancy Stone was now commanding the combined human forces after being promoted following the victory at the command post. She had spent the last week studying intelligence reports about the Death Guard, and what she learned made her blood run cold. The Death Guard were not ordinary Vorthik warriors. They were genetically enhanced from birth, trained from childhood to be perfect killing machines, and equipped with the most advanced weapons and armor the Vorthik Empire could produce. Each Death Guard warrior was worth 10 regular soldiers, and they had never lost a battle in 300 years of service. They're sending 5,000 Death Guard warriors, Nancy told her officers during a briefing aboard the Liberty's Edge. Our intelligence suggests they're planning to attack us in the asteroid belt of the Kepler 442 system. The asteroid belt was a dangerous place to fight. The floating rocks made it impossible for large ships to maneuver effectively, and the irregular gravity fields created by the asteroids made targeting systems unreliable. But Nancy realized that the same conditions that made the battle dangerous could also be turned to humanity's advantage. We've learned to adapt to changing conditions, Nancy said. The Death Guard are trained to fight in perfect formations with overwhelming firepower. But what happens when they can't use their formations and their targeting systems don't work properly? Nancy's plan was risky and unconventional, which made it perfectly suited to human tactics. Instead of trying to meet the Death Guard in direct combat, the human forces would use the asteroid field itself as a weapon. Pilot Chris Walker was assigned to lead the fighter squadron that would execute the most dangerous part of Nancy's plan. Chris had been flying combat missions for 2 years, and he had developed a reputation for being able to fly his ship to spaces that other pilots considered impossible. "We're going to use the asteroids as cover," Chris explained to his squadron. "The Death Guard ships are bigger and more powerful than ours, but they're also less maneuverable. We can use that against them." The Death Guard fleet arrived at the asteroid belt in perfect formation. Their ships were sleek and deadly, covered in weapons that could destroy a human fighter with a single shot. The Death Guard commander, a warrior known as the Executioner, transmitted a message to the human forces. "Surrender now and your deaths will be quick," the Executioner said in his translated voice. "Continue to resist and we will make you suffer before we kill you." Nancy's response was simple and direct. "Come and get us." The battle began when the Death Guard ships entered the asteroid field. Their formations were perfect, their weapons were charged, and their targeting systems were locked onto the human ships. But within minutes, their perfect order began to break down. The asteroids were constantly moving and colliding with each other, creating a chaotic environment that made coordinated attacks impossible. The Death Guard ships, designed for open space combat, found themselves struggling to navigate through the floating rocks. Chris Walker led his fighter squadron in a series of hit-and-run attacks that took advantage of the confusion. His fighters would appear from behind an asteroid, fire their weapons, and then disappear behind another rock before the Death Guard could respond. "This is Walker to all squadrons," Chris said over the radio. "Remember, we're not trying to destroy them in direct combat. We're trying to make them destroy themselves." The key to Nancy's strategy was using the asteroids as weapons. The human ships would maneuver the Death Guard vessels into positions where they would collide with the floating rocks. The Death Guard ships were strong enough to survive the impacts, but the collisions damaged their weapons and disrupted their formations. Marine Corps sniper Elena Rodriguez had been assigned to a special mission during the battle. She was positioned on a large asteroid that gave her a clear view of the Death Guard command ship. Her job was to eliminate the Death Guard field commanders, who were trying to coordinate the attack. Helena had modified her rifle with the same technology that Carolyn Wells had developed, and she was using the irregular gravity fields around the asteroids to curve her shots in impossible directions. The Death Guard commanders, protected by their advanced armor, had never faced an enemy who could shoot around corners. "Target acquired," Elena said into her radio as she lined up her shot on a Death Guard officer who was standing on his ships. Bridge. The shot traveled through the asteroid field, bouncing off gravity fields and following a curved path that would have been impossible in normal space. The bullet struck the Death Guard commander in the neck joint of his armor, and he fell. Their field commanders being eliminated one by one, the Death Guard formation began to collapse. The individual ships were still dangerous, but they were no longer fighting as a coordinated unit. The turning point of the battle came when Captain Janet Pierce, commanding the human destroyer USS Valiant, realized that her ship had been critically damaged and could not retreat. Janet made a decision that would become legendary in human military history. "All hands, this is the captain," Janet announced over the ship's intercom. "We're going to ram the Death Guard flagship." The USS Valiant's crew had 30 seconds to prepare for impact. They shut down all non-essential systems and braced for collision. Janet aimed her ship directly at the Death Guard command vessel and pushed the engines to maximum power. The impact was devastating. The USS Valiant punched through the Death Guard ship's armor and penetrated deep into its hull. But Janet had one more surprise for the enemy. Reactor overload in 10 seconds. Janet announced, "It's been an honor serving with you all." The explosion that followed the reactor overload didn't just destroy both ships. It created an electromagnetic pulse that disabled half the Death Guard fleet. The advanced electronics that made the Death Guard so effective were suddenly useless. In the chaos that followed, the remaining human forces launched a coordinated attack on the disabled Death Guard ships. The battle that the Death Guard had expected to win in minutes lasted for 6 hours and ended with the elite warriors retreating from the battlefield. It was the first time in 300 years that the Death Guard had been defeated. The victory at the asteroid belt changed everything. The galactic community no longer saw humans as weak or ineffective. The Council's military advisors began studying human tactics and requesting human officers for their own forces. The Zilani wanted to learn about human adaptability. The Korath were fascinated by human determination. The Thirani were amazed by human creativity. But the war was still not over. The Vorthik Supreme Commander, a legendary warrior known as the Dominator, had never personally entered a battle. He had been observing the human victories from his fortress on Kepler 442A, and he was beginning to understand that humanity represented a threat unlike any the Vorthik had faced before. The Dominator began consolidating all remaining Vorthik forces into his fortress. He was preparing for a final battle that would determine the fate of the war. Jake Morrison, now promoted to Admiral, stood on the bridge of the Liberty's Edge and watched the tactical reports from the asteroid belt battle. His people had achieved the impossible again, but he knew the real test was still ahead. The Dominator was not like the other Vorthik commanders. He had never been defeated, and he had spent his entire life preparing for war. The final battle would be against an enemy who understood humans and was ready for their unconventional tactics. Jake looked at the faces of his crew and felt a familiar determination. They had come so far from being considered the weakest members of the Council. They had proved that strength didn't come from technology or natural advantages, but from the willingness to adapt, to sacrifice, and to never give up. The galaxy was about to witness the final test of human courage, and Jake was confident that his people would not be found wanting. The fortress on Kepler 442A was unlike anything the Council forces had ever seen. It rose from the planet's surface like a metal mountain, its walls covered in weapons that could destroy ships from orbit. The Dominator had spent months preparing this stronghold, and he had filled it with every surviving Vorthik warrior from across the galaxy. General Robert Hayes stood in the war room of the Liberty's Edge, studying the holographic display that showed the fortress in detail. Robert had been promoted after his leadership during the asteroid belt battle, and he was now responsible for planning the final assault on the Vorthik stronghold. The fortress has energy shields that can withstand orbital bombardment, Robert explained to the assembled commanders. It has automated defense systems that have been perfected over centuries of warfare, and it contains over 10,000 Vorthik warriors who are fighting for their empire's survival. The Council fleet was larger than ever before. Ships from dozens of species had come to participate in the final battle. and they were all equipped with the latest weapons and technology. But everyone knew that taking the fortress would require more than superior firepower. "We need to get inside," Robert said. "The shields and weapons are designed to stop external attacks, but they're vulnerable from within. The problem is getting a team inside without being detected." The solution came from an unexpected source. The fortress's waste disposal system was connected to underground tunnels that led to the planet's natural cave system. The tunnels were narrow, toxic, and heavily guarded, but they offered the only way to infiltrate the stronghold without triggering its defenses. Lieutenant Commander Frank Mitchell volunteered to lead the infiltration team. Frank had survived the assault on the Vorthik command post, and he had become an expert in unconventional warfare. He knew that the mission was essentially suicide, but he also knew that someone had to do it. "I need volunteers for a one-way trip," Frank told the assembled troops. "We're going into the fortress through the waste tunnels, and we're going to disable their shield generator from the inside. The chances of survival are close to zero." Every human soldier in the room raised their hand. Frank selected his team carefully. He chose Sergeant Maria Santos, a communications specialist who could coordinate with the fleet during the assault. He picked Corporal Gary Adams, a combat engineer who understood explosives and electronic systems. The rest of his team consisted of Marines who had proven themselves in previous battles against the Vorthik. The main battle began at dawn. The Council fleet attacked the fortress with everything they had, sending waves of fighters and bombers against the energy shields, while the capital ships fired their most powerful weapons. The Vorthik responded with a devastating barrage that lit up the planet's sky with explosions and energy beams. The fortress's weapons were incredibly effective. They destroyed entire squadrons of attacking fighters and damaged several Council cruisers. But the attack served its purpose by keeping the Vorthik defenders focused on the external threat while Frank's team made their way through the underground tunnels. The tunnels were worse than Frank had imagined. They were filled with toxic waste that burned through equipment and made breathing difficult, even with protective gear. The passages were so narrow that the team had to crawl for kilometers through spaces that were barely wide enough for a human body. "This is Santos to base," Maria whispered into her radio. "We're 2 kilometers inside the tunnel system. The toxic levels are getting higher, but we're still moving forward." The team encountered their first Vorthik security patrol 3 hours into the infiltration. The enemy warriors were guarding a checkpoint that controlled access to the fortress's lower levels. Frank knew that a firefight would alert the entire garrison, so he decided to use stealth instead. Gary Adams had brought a new type of explosive device that had been developed by Carolyn Wells. It was designed to create a localized electromagnetic pulse that would disable Vorthik armor without causing a large explosion. Gary placed the devices around the checkpoint and activated them simultaneously. The Vorthik guards collapsed as their armor's life support systems failed. Frank's team quickly moved past the checkpoint and continued toward their target. The shield generator was located in the heart of the fortress, protected by multiple layers of security and defended by the Dominator's personal guard. These were the finest Vorthik warriors in existence, each one a veteran of dozens of battles and equipped with the most advanced armor and weapons the Empire could provide. "This is as far as we go together," Frank told his team when they reached the final access tunnel. "Santos, you stay here and coordinate with the fleet. Adams, you come with me to the generator. Everyone else, hold this position and make sure we have a way out." Frank and Gary crawled through the final tunnel and emerged in the generator chamber. The room was enormous, filled with machinery that hummed with barely contained energy. The shield generator itself was a massive device that pulsed with blue light, and it was surrounded by 20 Vorthik guards who stood like statues in their black armor. "How do we get past them?" Gary whispered. Frank looked around the chamber and noticed something important. The generator was connected to the fortress's main power grid, and the power conduits ran through the ceiling directly above their position. "We don't go through them," Frank said. "We go over them." Using climbing gear they had brought for the mission, Frank and Gary made their way up to the ceiling and began moving across the power conduits toward the generator. The Vorthic guards below them never looked up, confident that their position was impregnable. Frank was almost at the generator when disaster struck. One of the power conduits broke under his weight, and he fell 20 feet to the chamber floor. The impact broke several of his ribs and knocked the wind out of him, but more importantly, it alerted the guards to his presence. The Vorthic warriors turned toward Frank with their weapons ready, but Gary was already moving. He dropped from the ceiling directly onto the generator and began placing explosive charges on its critical components. "Stop him!" shouted the guard captain in his translated voice. The Vorthic opened fire on Gary, but he was protected by the generator's own shielding. Their energy weapons couldn't penetrate the field that surrounded the device. Gary worked frantically to set his charges, while Frank engaged the guards with his modified rifle. The battle in the generator chamber was brief but intense. Frank managed to kill 3 guards before being overwhelmed by superior numbers. Gary completed his sabotage just as a Vorthic energy beam pierced his chest and killed him instantly. But the damage was done. The explosive charges detonated in sequence, and the shield generator began to overload. Frank, bleeding from multiple wounds, activated his radio one last time. "Santos, this is Mitchell. The shields are down. Tell the fleet to come through the breach." The fortress's energy shields collapsed just as the Dominator himself arrived in the generator chamber. The legendary Vorthic commander stood over Frank's broken body, his massive armor gleaming in the emergency lighting. "You have cost me my empire, human," the Dominator said, "but you will not live to see your victory." Frank looked up at his enemy and managed to smile through his pain. "I don't need to live to see it. I just need to know that it's coming." The Dominator raised his weapon to kill Frank, but the human had one last surprise. He activated the final explosive device that Gary had given him, a powerful charge that was designed to bring down the chamber's support structure. The explosion killed both Frank and the Dominator, but it also opened a massive breach in the fortress's defenses. A council fleet poured through the gap, and within hours, the Vorthic stronghold had fallen. The war ended not with a grand victory ceremony, but with exhausted soldiers counting their losses and trying to understand what they had accomplished. The Vorthic Empire, faced with the complete destruction of their military leadership, agreed to peace negotiations. Admiral Jake Morrison stood in the ruins of the fortress and looked at the memorial that had been erected for Frank Mitchell and the other humans who had died in the final battle. The inscription was simple but powerful. They thought we were powerless. They were wrong. The galaxy's perception of humanity had changed forever. The species that had been considered the weakest member of the Council was now respected as the warriors who had saved the galaxy from Vorthic conquest. Other species sent their military leaders to study human tactics, and human officers were requested for positions throughout the young Council's armed forces. But Jake knew that the real victory wasn't in the battles they had won or the respect they had earned. It was in proving that strength didn't come from natural advantages or superior technology. It came from the willingness to stand up when others fell down, to adapt when others broke, and to sacrifice when others ran away. 5 years later, Jake stood in the council chambers on the anniversary of the war's end. Representatives from dozens of species had gathered to honor the human sacrifice that had saved them all from Vorthic domination. Dr. Amy Foster, now the Council's chief medical officer, had developed new treatments based on her research during the war. Engineer Carolyn Wells had become the head of the Council's weapons development program. The surviving veterans of the war had gone on to become leaders in their RESP,